deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lozon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs, where we dive into the stories, the crimes, and the hard times of the complicated world of wrongful convictions. Join us every week as we shed light on the heart-wrenching and controversial stories of wrongful convictions by examining the system errors that put innocent people behind bars.
Episode 3, Don't Blink. Highlight case, Michel Dumont. Guest, Elizabath Loftus.
Imagine you're at home, spending a typical night with a few friends. You sit around and play cards until around 10 p.m. A night like any other. Unbeknownst to you, a sexual assault is happening somewhere that will transform your life forever. A month after that forgettable night with friends, the police contact you. They call to inform you that you've been identified as a possible suspect in a sexual assault case because you match a composite drawing. They advise you they'll be coming by to question you. Obviously, a misunderstanding, you agree to talk with them. They arrive at your house, you answer some questions, and they ask you if they can take your photo. You consent. They request that you take off your glasses for the photo. You do. That's it. They leave. 2 days later, they return to your home to arrest you. They handcuff you, and the neighbors watch as you are led outside and put in the back of a police car. You feel humiliated being paraded out of your home like this. You don't even know exactly what you're being arrested for. When you get to the police station, the police tell you that they know you committed a sexual assault last month. They comment on the fact that you're unemployed, you recently broke up with your girlfriend, and you must obviously have a grudge against women. They pressure you to confess, but you tell them over and over again that they've made a mistake. You aren't given a bail hearing until the next day, so you have to spend the night in jail. The stress and anxiety you're experiencing are crippling. Now you're out on bail, thanks to your brother's generosity, awaiting your preliminary hearing coming up in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, your photo is used as part of a police photo lineup for the victim. Remember your glasses? At the preliminary hearing, you get to see the victim for the first time. You've never set eyes on her before. You're positive that as soon as she sees you, right here in the courtroom, she'll let everyone know it wasn't you. She'll realize her mistake from identifying you from the photo lineup, and this will all be done. But that's not what happens. She assuredly says it was you. You are the person who raped her. If the stress and anxiety were crippling before, imagine your heart rate now. Identified and arrested. Hopefully, still innocent until proven guilty. Because next, you will have to stand trial. You will have to prove that you are not the person she saw. For Michel Dumont, the effects of a mistaken eyewitness identification would haunt him for years. Today on Real Life Wrongs, we'll show how eyewitness identification and testimony has been found to be the leading contributing factor in cases of wrongful conviction, and what we can do about the untrustworthy accounts of what we think we see. But first, let's get to the details of the crime.
So the victim was forced into her apartment at knife point. Inside her apartment, she's sexually assaulted in her bedroom. The man with the knife threatens to kill her if she screams. and the assault continued for over an hour.
All right. Although all of this may sound completely unbelievable, the truth is mistaken identification happens more than we would like to admit. As always, let's break it down. What is eyewitness identification, Kelly, or should we call it misidentification?
Well, in a legal sense, eyewitness testimony is the description of an event that a witness or a victim believes they saw. It's usually the first thing that the police turn to when they're gathering information at the crime scene. It's also often considered to be one of the most convincing forms of evidence at trial. But the reality is, research has shown us that it's actually the most flawed form of evidence.
Yeah, it makes you want to say, like, hey, let's scrap the whole thing then. No more eyewitness ID. There, done.
Yeah, but then we'd have nothing to talk about. We're getting there. Truth is, there have been studies done since the 70s, but the findings and the recommendations weren't taken seriously until the DNA revolution, when DNA could prove how wrong eyewitness identifications really were. And to add to these studies, the Innocence Project has proven, with the help of DNA evidence, that over 70% of wrongful convictions are due to faulty eyewitness identifications. So based on these studies, researchers have concluded that witnesses are going to identify an innocent person in about 20% of all real-life criminal lineups. So what this means is that 1 in 5 eyewitnesses are going to give sworn testimony that can put an innocent person in prison. I mean, obviously, not every person that's picked out of a lineup is going to be convicted, but it still shows us how dangerous eyewitness identifications can be.
So there have been studies done for decades, and we know it's faulty, but we also know that it can still work. If an innocent person is not wrongfully convicted from an eyewitness ID, then perhaps it isn't all that harmful.
Okay, would you buy a car whose brakes could potentially fail on every 5th trip? Or would you go to a doctor who could potentially prescribe the wrong medication to every 5th patient?
I wouldn't cross the street if one out of every 5 times I'm going to get hit. But eyewitness testimony is still influential at trial.
Yeah. And I mean, I think part of this is we have to remember that real life isn't like CSI. In most cases, there isn't DNA or other biological evidence left behind for us to test. So in a lot of cases, all we're left with is the word of a witness. And knowing this, lawyers will spend a lot of time preparing their eyewitnesses for trial because they want them to present their testimony with confidence.
Right. And it's the confidence factor that convinces juries. Problem is, confidence does not equal accuracy. And confidence can be convincing even to yourself. Our memories play tricks on us. Our memory can become skewed with time. But then there's other factors as well, right?
Yes, of course. And I think this is a great time to hear from Elizabath Loftus, who is an American cognitive psychologist and an expert on human memory. And she's the leader in the field of expert identification. And Elizabath spoke with us about how she came to research human memory and some of the leading causes of how our memory gets it wrong. And then she also went on to tell us about how her findings brought her to the world of wrongful convictions.
You keep talking about eyewitness identification.
Yes.
And usually that is applied to the kind of limited situation, important but limited situation where you're trying to identify a person who may or may not have been seen before. And of course, that's crucial in the legal system. We want to be accurate when we identify people who are suspects and asking, is this the perpetrator? But I like to use the term eyewitness testimony to refer to the broader collection of things that witnesses have to remember, some of which are absolutely crucial to the solving of a crime or the resolution of who caused an accident, but they don't have to do with identifying a suspect. Sometimes people are remembering something like, was the traffic light red or green? Or who made the first move? Was it an aggressive move or was it self-defense? So it's not about the identity all the time. It's often about memory for other details.
What is your own relationship to memory, knowing what you know or what you think you know?
I think the work that I've been doing, which shows that, people who are attempting to be honest and accurate and complete in their memory are often mistaken. They're mistaken for a number of different reasons. And this has made me a little bit more tolerant of the mistakes that my friends make, my family members make, or even I myself might make in recounting an experience. Memory can be contaminated. One of the key ways is when people are exposed to some kind of new information, particularly if it's misinformation. And this can happen when witnesses talk to each other after they've witnessed something in common, like they're there at the scene of a crime or at the scene of an accident. It can happen when people are interrogated by an investigator who has an agenda or a hypothesis about what happened and communicates things to the witness, even inadvertently. It can happen when, particularly if people see a high publicity event and they turn on media, the news or social media now, and they get new information about the event that they might themselves have experienced. If it's misinformation, it can contaminate or distort somebody's recollection.
It's just interesting that this myth of the infallibility of the human memory persists.
Right. And maybe I can even present an example that's going to be very unpopular, but to talk about. But if you remember when Christine Blasey Ford came forward and accused Brett Kavanaugh of something that happened, 3 decades ago when she was supposedly 15 and he was supposedly 17. And you see her tell her story on television, and it's so compelling. And I had to stop myself when I would hear that story and say, wait a minute, 35 years ago, there's all kinds of questions to ask about this story. We can't just uncritically accept it without any kind of scrutiny or questioning. And that's what millions and millions of people did. And I felt myself how tempting it was to do that with everything I already know about the malleability of memory. Now, many times when I read somebody's accusation in the paper, I say to myself, I wonder if this is a distorted memory. I can do that. Other people aren't doing that.
How would you perhaps suggest that we can remedy this, or we can spread further awareness and have people look at things more critically?
This is kind of tricky. You would think that maybe the stories of wrongful convictions that have been exposed by the hard work of many innocence projects now around North America and in other parts of the world, the hard work and the exposure of those wrongful convictions, the tragedies involved, the tragedies not only for the person who spent 5 or 10 or 15 years in prison for something they didn't do, but for the extended families and the children who had to live with these wrongful convictions, the sometimes massive compensation that occasionally gets paid rightfully to these wrongly convicted people, that the publicity about this doesn't seem to be enough to change this instinctive kind of mindset. It's hard to imagine what would, because it often, people are not that responsive to statistics and raw, cold numbers, but they are often responsive to stories, to human interest stories. And this story after story after story that we have been hearing about maybe it makes a little dent for a little while. I wouldn't be surprised if it did, if we were to do that kind of study, but it doesn't seem to have made a big dent. In my own work, we show people simulated crimes or simulated accidents, and then we deliberately expose them to some post-event misinformation. They might see a crime, for example, where the thief is wearing a green jacket, and we convince them that we expose them to the misinformation that the jacket was brown. And when we do this, many people will adopt the misinformation, incorporate it into their memory, and they'll now give an erroneous report. They'll say, in this example, they'll say they remember the jacket was brown. We can supply the misinformation by having a witness overhear another witness's version that's mistaken, or asking them a leading question, or any of a variety of ways that we can plant this misinformation that model what happens out there in the real world, in real world cases. And we have done now decades of work, not just my own laboratory discoveries, but many, many scientists around the world showing the conditions under which people are especially susceptible to having their memories be influenced, or the kinds of people who are especially susceptible, or any of a number of issues that come up that we've examined in this work on memory distortion. And all of this contributes to our understanding of the malleable nature of memory, and does lead to some suggestions about how the system could modify its procedures a little bit to reduce the chances of a mistaken memory and a wrongful verdict that arises from it. When a witness is trying to identify a perpetrator from a 6-pack, 6 photographs, or from a lineup. So based on scientific work, there have been recommendations about how those identification tests should be conducted. So for example, what instructions do you give to the witness before you test them? It's very important to say something like, I'm going to give you a test, and the person may or may not be in this set of photos or in this lineup. It's just as important to exonerate the innocent as to find the guilty person. What you want to do is take the pressure off of a person to pick someone, anyone, just to see this crime solved. So that's an issue. What kind of instructions? What do the fillers look like? The people who are in the lineup or in the set of photos who are not the suspect. You might think, okay, just have them resemble the suspect. But it's not as simple as that. They not only need to sort of resemble the suspect, but they need to match the description that the witness originally gave. So there are other things to consider when you're picking the fillers or foils to put into the test, as science has shown. In one case in which I testified, the witness looked at 6 photographs, said, I don't see the person. And the interviewer says, I saw your eyes drifting down to number 6. Take a look at that one again. And number 6 gets picked. You don't want that to happen. That's not fair. You'd like somebody to be conducting the test who doesn't know who the suspect is and can't do something like that. And, another reason why that's a kind of a risky situation is it's so tempting for that person to give feedback to the witness. The witness says, well, how did I do? Did I pick the right one? And if somebody who knows can say, yeah, you did. Yeah, that's our suspect. That's not good. It artificially inflates the confidence of the witness. It makes them more impervious to cross-examination, more confident and influential in the trial. It's not a good situation. But if you have a blind tester, somebody who doesn't know who the suspect is, they can't do that.
How does the cross-racial factor make it more difficult?
Well, there have been studies for decades now that show that when people try to identify the face of a stranger of a different race, they make more mistakes. It's been done with, blacks and whites trying to identify strangers of a different race. It's been done with Asians. It's been done with Arabs and Israelis. It's been done with so many different Hispanics and non-Hispanic individuals. And routinely, these studies show that people make more mistakes. In fact, even children as young as maybe 6 years old have this cross-racial identification deficit. Now, there are lots of ideas about why this happens, and their theories and speculations. But the fact of the matter is it does. We make more mistakes when we try to identify a stranger of a different race. And that's a factor that has been mentioned by expert witnesses in cases where such expert testimony has been allowed, when it's a factor in the case. We live in a society where even unpopular people deserve a defense. They deserve to be considered innocent till proven guilty. And even if they did some things, it doesn't mean they did everything they are accused of. And not everybody gets to go walk up to the ATM machine and say the word abuse, and many will spew out. And yet there are many people in our society who seem to feel that any accusation has got to be believed, no matter how dubious, and that we shouldn't be questioning it. And that bothers me greatly.
So many factors, human factors, come into play in eyewitness testimony. Surely these kinds of things would be considered throughout the process of taking an eyewitness statement.
You'd think so, but let's look at what happened in the Anthony Hannemeyer case. So it's 5 a.m. Teenage girl is asleep and a stranger breaks into her room. He has a knife and he's about to assault her when her mom wakes up and goes to her daughter's room. Stranger's frightened and he escapes through the window and drives off. The mom is so driven to identify the stranger that she starts conducting her own investigation. And she starts going around asking everyone if they know someone with blonde hair, blue eyes, small ears, and a baby face. Eventually, a construction company that was working down the street from the victim says the description sounds an awful lot like Anthony Hannemeyer. And he just quit his job 5 days ago.
Bingo.
Yeah, so mom goes to the police with this information and they provide her with a photo lineup and she picks Anthony out. Anthony's arrested and brought to trial. During the first day of the trial, mom positively and confidently points Anthony out as the attacker. After the testimony, it was clear to Anthony that he would most likely be found guilty. And even his lawyer advised him to take the 2-year deal that he was being offered, or he was no doubt going to be convicted and face 6 to 10 years in prison. So he's scared, confused, feeling hopeless. And he ends up accepting the deal and confesses to a crime he didn't commit. So obviously, eyewitness testimony played a huge role in Anthony's wrongful conviction. The mother was so confident and emotional and positive that it was Anthony that broke into her daughter's room.
Yeah, and so since our eyes may not be so good or trustworthy, let's look at this a little closer. The break-in happened at 5 a.m., so it was probably dark. And because this happened at 5 a.m., the mom was wakened by the attack. I would think this would mean that she was possibly sleepy and not entirely alert yet. There was a knife involved. Studies show that when a weapon is involved, witnesses pay far more attention to the weapon than to the person holding the weapon. And we have to remember that the victim's mother only saw the attacker for a few seconds before he escaped. And was the light on?
You know what? That's a good question. I cannot be sure, but it was 5 a.m. and everybody's sleeping, so I'm guessing no.
Yeah, so when you look at it, it seems like a lot of factors that could affect how accurate her identification was or maybe wasn't.
Yeah, and yet none of these variables were questioned when she was on the witness stand. The lawyers were more concerned with how sure she was that the person that she saw was Anthony Hannemeyer. And because she came across as being so positive, even the defense thought that Anthony was sunk.
So there was a huge opportunity missed here. You have to wonder why the defense didn't try to discredit the identification by questioning any of these things. Just like as a side note, point of interest, years later, Paul Bernardo, known then as the Scarborough rapist, a man with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a baby face. I don't know if he has small ears, admitted to being responsible for this attack. But, you know, you mentioned that there are things that we can control and that those things can also affect an identification. So, like, what does this mean? How do we control things that can affect an identification?
So there's things like the way that the lineup is presented to the witness, or the instructions that are given to the witness, or feedback that's given to the witness when they're making their identification, or the way that the questions are asked, what words they use. So, you know, there's a lot of things that can influence who a witness picks out of a lineup.
And these factors have a big impact on a witness's identification.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's look at the case of Ivan Henry, just as an example to see how this all comes together. So the case, there was a string of sexual assaults in downtown Vancouver in the early 80s. And even though there was another more viable suspect, the police focused on Ivan Henry because he was known to them. Henry claimed that he was picked up by the police, escorted to the station. He wasn't given the chance to speak to a lawyer, and then he was forcibly dragged into a lineup room. So he stood in a lineup with 6 other men. Now, I think it's important to note that the suspect was described as having red hair. And the only person in the lineup with red hair was Ivan Henry.
Bingo.
Yeah. So we have to remember, it's the police's job to make a lineup of people who all resemble the description of the suspect. They don't have to look alike, but they should match the description. Otherwise, if you're looking for someone with red hair, in this case, Ivan Henry is obviously going to stand out. And then, during the lineup, Ivan was described as being uncooperative, and he eventually had to be restrained by officers. During the lineup procedure, he was physically restrained by police officers. And 11 of the sexual assault victims viewed that exact lineup. So you're trying to pick a guy out who's being held in a headlock.
Yeah, that's bingo again, guy.
Yeah, like your attention is obviously going to be drawn to the man in the headlock. So if you're the victim, I think that obviously it's abundantly clear who you're supposed to pick out. And when showed this lineup, Some of the victims picked out Henry and then made statements to the officers like, I didn't want to let you down. I didn't want to disappoint you. So, I mean, really, you have to question how much of the identification was based on what they remembered and how much was influenced by the presentation of the lineup. Nonetheless, with the identifications, Ivan Henry was found guilty, declared a dangerous offender, and given an indeterminate sentence. And he served 27 years before being released.
So, point to grow on: when put into a police lineup, don't get yourself in a headlock.
Yes, that's the take-home message.
Right. So basically with this lineup, questions should have been raised as to why there weren't more redheads or why Ivan Henry was in a headlock.
Exactly. And unlike the Hannemeyer case, these are things that should have been controlled by the police.
Yeah. And they're all confirmation that the use of eyewitness identification and also eyewitness testimony, thank you, Elizabeth, is a significant flaw in our justice system. So let's look back at the case of Michel Dumont from the other side.
So the victim was coming home from church and she was attacked at knife point and she was forced into her apartment where she was assaulted. So being violently attacked with a weapon is stressful. And your mind is probably far more focused on survival than on remembering the details, like if the person had brown eyes or short hair or, had a scar over his left eye. And after the attack, the victim cleaned her apartment, which is completely understandable, but it also destroyed any physical evidence of the attack.
It's a tough one.
I know. And then it took her 2 days to go to the police to report the attack. Again, not unusual. But because so much time had passed and she told the police that she cleaned her apartment, they didn't even go to her apartment. So there's no physical evidence recovered. So all we have as evidence in this case is her description of the attacker. Now, she described her attacker as being 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, chubby, with tattoos, and no glasses. So all we have as evidence in this case is her description of the attacker. And she describes the attacker as being 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, chubby, with tattoos, and no glasses. So based on that description, the police create a composite sketch of the attacker. So let's keep in mind, a composite sketch should be used only as a tool in the search for an assailant. This should not be your definitive guide in making an arrest. Because, like any other eyewitness identification, it's based on one person's recollection, right? And when the victim saw the drawing, she admitted she wasn't really happy with it. She said it was only about maybe 70, 80% accurate. But despite the lack of confidence in the drawing, the police decided to go ahead and share it with the public.
Wow. It seems a little loose. I mean, 70 to 80% accurate. I don't know. Maybe we'd want a little higher percentage. I don't know. But from the POV of the police, an anonymous call is made claiming that the sketch resembles Dumont. Police approach Dumont and asked to photograph him, thinking he has nothing to hide. Dumont agreed. Of course, the police take this picture to the victim, and she confidently identified Dumont as the assailant. This is an interesting identification, given that Dumont was 5'8", 120 pounds, with glasses, but no tattoos. Based on the identification, the police arrest Dumont. The victim testifies at court with confidence that Dumont was her attacker. Michel Dumont had a solid alibi confirmed by 5 people. All alibi witnesses placed Mr. Dumont at a card game the night of the attack, and there was nothing linking him to the crime except the victim's identification. Troubles for Dumont continued to pile up when the judge excluded all of his alibi witnesses. This meant that the victim's identification was the only evidence against him. And remember, the police had not collected any physical evidence. There were no witnesses to the crime. And now Dumont could not provide an alibi.
Yeah. So, based on the positive identification, Michel Dumont was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But then new developments occur. Developments that can change the course of a person's life. So 6 months after Dumont had been convicted, the victim was at her local video store and she saw a man that she said looked exactly like the person who assaulted her. So she started to doubt her identification.
And then police did not question her about her change of identification for 2 months. Eventually, the police investigated and confirmed the victim had changed her mind about Dumont being her attacker, and she signed an affidavit clearing him. But unfortunately, Dumont's lawyer claimed that they were never made aware of the new statement.
So in the fall of 1992, he filed an appeal, and while he was waiting for his appeal, he was freed and allowed to live in the community. In the spring of 94, the appeal was denied. So his bail is rescinded and he's picked up by the police once again and sent back to prison.
I mean, once again, a spectacle was made of Dumont's arrest. Armed police officers surrounded the apartment building where he lived. Dumont was led out to the police car in handcuffs, and everyone watched what was going on. So once again, humiliated. When he returned to prison, he continuously received death threats and was beaten by other inmates. Because he was a prisoner convicted of sexual assault, he was stigmatized and abused not only by the outside world, but also by the inmates. And to make matters worse, while in prison, he learned that his ex-wife had put his children in foster care. He realized that his children were now in a prison of their own and that they were serving their own sentence, all because of one initial misidentification. So, where is Michel Dumont now?
So for 2 years, the victim continued to try to get anyone to listen to her recantation of the identification. She contacted investigators, she went on television shows, all in an effort to try to set the record straight. Michel's wife, Solange, also fought for his release, and she filed an application for ministerial review based on the witness's new statement, and she brought Michel's story to the media. Once it was made public that the witness had recanted her identification and publicly stated that she identified the wrong person, the inmates who once threatened Dumont were now apologizing to him.
Dumont was released from prison in 1997 after serving 2/3 of his sentence. The victim waited for him outside the prison gates to apologize for her mistake that led to his wrongful conviction. Now that he was released, he set out to get his life back in order, and his first step was to get his 2 children out of foster care and back home. They were all reunited in 1999. In 1998, the Justice Minister ordered a review of his case and ultimately ordered a new trial. With the documentation of the victim's recantation, Dumont's conviction was quashed in 2001 by the Quebec Court of Appeal, and he was acquitted. Finally, 4 years after his release, he was fully exonerated of the crime he never committed. And in Dumont's words, "I had to wear the image of a rapist like a coat for 7 years. I finally get to take it off."
In May 2004, he announced that he and his family were seeking $8.7 million for wrongdoing by the police and the prosecutors, for his mistreatment in prison, and for the abuse of his children while in the custody of the state. Solange, who had used all of her savings trying to free Dumont, said publicly, "Instead of being compensated, we have debts." And On July 20th, 2009, a judge in Montreal ruled against Dumont's claims and dismissed his lawsuit. According to compensation guidelines, in order to qualify for compensation, it isn't sufficient to simply be acquitted. The appeals court must find that the person did not commit the offense, which means that the wrongfully convicted person has to establish factual innocence.
Okay, so the Quebec government decided that Dumont was not entitled to compensation because, in their view, he wasn't wrongfully convicted. The prosecutors can't be held responsible for the fact that the victim, who had clearly identified her aggressor, would later raise doubts that would ultimately lead to an acquittal.
So it was argued that the Court of Appeal didn't say that he was innocent. The Court of Appeal simply said that he shouldn't have been convicted. So when you have an eyewitness identification, you also need some corroborating evidence, even if it's just circumstantial. And in this case, there was nothing. So this also meant that there was nothing available to prove that he didn't commit the crime.
And so we'll hear one more time from Elizabath Loftus, who shared her thoughts about necessary improvements to the justice system.
Maybe you don't have an expert come in, but the judge can issue some jury instructions that can educate the jury about the nature of memory, about some of the factors that are important to think about and how they work. And there's some really great jury instructions that have been written. One set coming out of the state of New Jersey, for example, the Henderson instructions that provide a pretty nice education for jurors. So these are some of the things that can happen in a trial if a person now has gotten to the stage where they're on trial and their prosecution is based on eyewitness testimony.
What is something that stands out to you that everyone should be aware of when it comes to eyewitness statements?
I think the take-home message from this work, that just because somebody tells you something and with a lot of confidence and with a lot of detail and even emotional as they tell it to you, whether it's identifying somebody or whether it's some other kind of memory detail, it doesn't mean it really happened. The only way you can know for sure whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or one that's a product of some other process is to have some independent corroboration.
So because research on eyewitness identifications, I feel like I should say testimony, has been done for decades, there's been ample time to make suggestions on how to improve the process. What is frustrating is that while some of these suggestions have worked their way into some precincts and offices, many of these suggestions have continued to go unheeded. So, Kelly, what's your review on what needs to change?
Well, I mean, I think there's just a lot of system variables that we need to really consider when we're collecting eyewitness statements, because we can't do anything about the things that are outside of the criminal justice system. We can't change if it's dark or, if they're far away from the crime. But something like properly selecting the fillers for a lineup is something that we need to be mindful of, right? Like, we're not going to have just one redhead when we say we're looking for a redhead. We need to have unbiased witness instructions. So, one of the big things that the research has pointed to is that simple things like telling an eyewitness, okay, I'm going to show you an eyewitness, or I'm going to show you a lineup, and the suspect may or may not be in the lineup, actually has a big impact on reducing false positive identifications, because they're not feeling pressured to have to pick someone, right? Something simple like having a double blind lineup, super important. Because if the guy who's administering the lineup knows who you're supposed to pick, they can inadvertently guide you to make that selection, right? Like,
right. So the actual person who's been accused may not be in the lineup. And on top of that, the investigator does not know who has been accused when they're guiding the victim through the lineup.
Or they may not even know if the person, like if the suspect isn't, they may not know either that the suspect is in the lineup, right? Yeah. Because if they know that the suspect is number 2, when the witness makes an identification, let's say they say it's number 4, the person, the officer administering the lineup may say something like, are you sure about that? Right? Are you sure about that identification? That's obviously going to make them doubt who they're picking.
Especially in a high stress situation like that, just having someone say, are you sure, can subconsciously affect the outcome.
Exactly. And I mean, I can't say it enough. Education is key. We really need to understand that our memories don't work the way that they show us on TV. It's not a camera. It's not going to give you instant playback and it's going to be 100% accurate, right? We can't always know. Time is going to change your memories. Can you remember what happened last Thursday with great detail, right? And
not unless I check my to-do list from that day.
Sure. And if I said, what were you wearing last Thursday? Could you tell me?
Drawn a blank.
Yeah. So why do we expect somebody to come in and give details like that about a crime that happened 6 months ago, right? We need people to understand it doesn't work this way.
So there are changes, and some have already begun, and there's still work to be done. Next time you want to tell on somebody for something you saw, think about it. We must ask ourselves, do I really remember? When walking down memory lane, consider how many details you're imagining based on outside influence, subliminal messages, and time. Can you even know what you don't know? And most importantly, how many tequilas in was I? If you're in a position to have an impact on someone's life from something you say, remember everything you heard on this podcast today. How much of what we've said do you absolutely remember? The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to almost anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for listening.
I'm Kelly Lozon.
And I'm Kelly Fanson. For excerpts and additional information about our podcast and the world of wrongful convictions, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can watch video portions of our podcast on YouTube and Instagram. If you'd like more information, visit our website, realliferongs.com. Drop us a line.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen to anybody.
Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Glutch, promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.